Guess what, Lions? For as little as $5 a month, you can get access to exclusive bonus audio content and help this program grow by joining the Lions of Liberty Pride. To learn more, head over to lionsofliberty.com/support.
I find people who just say, well, if you just get rid of the state, all our problems will be solved. I find those to be the most boring and useless articles imaginable. Nobody finds that convincing.
Welcome to the Lions of Liberty podcast. Here is your host, your guide, your shining beacon of liberty, Marc, Clair.
Roar, roar, roar. That's what lions sound like, isn't it? Something like that. Either way, I'm glad to have you guys back here for another edition of Lions of Liberty, the OG flagship program here at the Lions of Liberty podcast. Of course, we provide you three very unique, very distinct shows every week. Of course, every Wednesday, you've got Brian McWilliams bringing you a hefty dose of comedy, culture, and liberty with Electric Liberty Land. And then over on Fridays, John Odermatt takes a deep dive into all the injustices in our broken criminal justice system on Felony Friday. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and check them all out. And I gotta say, I'm getting both nervous and excited about the 300th episode of this program. I never dreamed I would actually produce 300 episodes of this show when I started out over 3 years ago. It's been quite the journey, and I do have some pretty big plans in store for episode 300. I know it's going to be really hard to top my episode 200, where I got to interview my political hero, really, in many ways. Of course, the one and only Dr. Ron Paul. Go ahead and check that out. I'll post a link to that in today's show notes, which you can find at lionsofliberty.com/296, because this is, of course, the 296th episode of this program, just 4 away from that 300th episode, and you already might have an idea of what I'm doing for that show if you're a member of the Lions of Liberty Pride, because they've gotten a little sneak peek at my plans. But for the rest of you, I'll be announcing that here on this show very shortly, but we are not quite there yet. I've got a few more guests to bring to you between now and then, starting right now. With me today is the editor of the Mises Wire over at Mises.org, as well as The Austrian, also published by the Mises Institute. He is also the author of the book, Commie, Cowboys, the Bourgeoisie, and the Nation State in the Western Genre. I am pleased to welcome Ryan McMaken. Ryan, are you ready to roar?
Yes, I drank a bunch of coffee, and this is me at my most roar-like.
Okay, that's very good, because, you know, I actually sometimes get criticisms out there in the YouTubes that I'm a little too hyped up, that I have a little too much energy, and sometimes that's actually because I did drink too much coffee. I have only had a little today, so we'll see how our energies match up.
It'll be great. It's going to be great.
Now, Ryan, we'll talk about more of your work that you're doing at the Mises Institute and a lot of the articles you've written recently in a bit, but as well as your book, I'd like to touch on as well. But I want to learn first a little bit more about yourself. So why don't you take us all back, give us a little bit of a glimpse into how you first became interested in libertarian ideas?
Well, a lot of it's lost in the mists of time back in the late 1990s. But when I became I guess when I started self-identifying as libertarian, it probably was when I went to the Mises Institute when I was 21, or maybe slightly before then. But I had a professor at the University of Colorado, and he was an Austrian. His name was Fred Glahe, and he had been an editor for the Austrian Economics Review, I believe was the name of the journal back then. And he said, oh, well, this summer you should go down to the Mises Institute for this Mises University thing that they have. And I had kind of heard of it, but I wasn't really active with that sort of thing at all. And so he got me into that. And then I flew down. All I had to do was cover my plane ticket. So I went down there, and the brainwashing worked. After a week of being at the Mises Institute, I totally bought into it all. And I just started, a few years later, I started writing columns for Lou Rockwell's site, which was back then kind of the only libertarian site really on the web. We're talking like 1999 here. And it was either that or National Review if you were reading that sort of thing. And so I wrote for that for, more than a decade and so on. And then eventually just because I had come to know Lou pretty well, ended up working at the Mises Institute. And but there's no great dramatic story there where I had some great aha moment or anything like that. I did like after I went to Mises University, I became more familiar with Rothbard's work, and in graduate school read a lot of Mises. But it wasn't any sort of like religious enlightenment moment or anything like that. It was just a slow process of being convinced by what I regarded to be the superior arguments of this group.
So when you first showed up there at the Mises Institute back there in the hazy late 90s, you weren't really going into it thinking about political philosophy or anything like that. Was it really just because it was sold to you as an interesting economics thing to go do? You weren't really thinking of anything grander outside of that?
Well, I think I had some sense of what they were going to talk about because I had been reading the Freeman back when it was a physical magazine back then. And had read some articles on Mises.org, which was a new website at the time. Of course, the internet had like 5 websites back then, and Mises.org was one of them. We had a huge market share of the internet back then. And so, I mean, I guess I had some idea of it, but no, the extent to all the information, the tradition that was there and all of that was all new to me back then.
And what was it about? You say they had the superior arguments. So what was it about those arguments that really sucked you, I guess, further in beyond maybe just some of the surface level economic stuff and really into the broader libertarian philosophy? Did you see a lot of the overlap between maybe some of the stuff you began to agree with on the economic side and were able to apply that even to other areas, in political philosophy?
Well, on the economic side, if you just having just approached Mises, it's so thorough in its argumentation. It's so detailed. Every time you read Mises, you come away feeling like this is a guy who's considered every angle, who thought about every possible objection. And so when you're done, you just think, wow, this guy is just so eminently reasonable. He thought of everything. And so that was certainly on the economic side a big influence. On the larger libertarian stuff, that was probably more to religious issues, actually. It was over at this time I had converted from atheism to Catholicism, and I actually ended up being sucked in through that to Rothbard's larger natural law arguments and those sort of things. And actually, the more religious I became, the more radicalized I became, especially on the war issue, the more anti-war I became. And so that was probably a larger influence on just the larger philosophical libertarian side of things.
I actually want to dive into that a little bit further. That's a very interesting path to me. You don't often hear, first of all, you don't really often hear about atheists, becoming Catholic. I mean, that does happen, obviously, but you often hear about people leaving the church or going from religion and becoming atheists. But you actually went from atheism to Catholicism, but then that actually brought you over more so to Rothbard and his natural rights arguments, which is interesting because Rothbard didn't really take a religious tact on natural rights. He just sort of presumed them and had several different ways to get there. And it basically said, you can get there any way you get there. But once we're here, here's what we can extrapolate from this point. So can you delve a little bit further into, I guess, how that path you were going through and your religious beliefs, how that sort of melded with the ideas of liberty and how that all played out?
Well, if you get into some of the nuts and bolts of it and you dig even deeper and you go down those
and this could be a 5-hour discussion, so
right.
I know this is probably too deep to fully cover right here, but I do find the path pretty fascinating.
Well, these also were the days of now St. John Paul II. And if you read his stuff, there's a huge emphasis on the dignity of the individual person and the individual rights of the person and their status as a human being, granting them an inviolable nature as a person. So you can't steal from this person. You can't kill people. You can't regard other people as things. And this really feeds into the larger libertarian natural law and natural rights types of theories where what is aggression, right? And is taxation theft and those sorts of things. Now, you would find, I think, on the Catholic side, a lot of those people who would say, well, yeah, taxation is permissible. However, when you start to dig deeper, what you find is that taxation is permissible strictly from prudential grounds. not on rights grounds. Like the state doesn't have rights. The state can't take your stuff because it has some right to it. People just generally will tolerate, or people can argue that, okay, you can tolerate taxation just for prudential reasons. And of course, people do that all the time, even libertarians, myself included. I don't violently revolt against the tax system because I want to stay out of prison. So there are prudential reasons for tolerating taxation. But it's not quite what a lot of people think it is, that, yes, there's these moral grounds for taxation and for the state using force. It's far more complex than that, and it doesn't really get in the way at all of Rothbard's libertarian arguments. And so it was really being more won over to this idea of each individual person having these rights and that we have to respect those rights. I think that started to radicalize me and make me seem more Rothbardian.
I suppose there's a difference between sort of accepting taxation to a certain extent, whereas they might just say, all right, well, don't get yourself killed or put into jail protesting a 30-cent tax on a tea bag or something like that. Maybe that's not the best way to go. That's a different thing than saying we agree that this method is morally perfect and morally good and something we should just accept on a moral level. Is that kind of the difference you would see there?
Yes, and certainly there are always many grounds as well in this, in the Catholic intellectual tradition for refusing, of course, to take orders from the state when the state is in the wrong. And a lot of this can be up to the interpretation of the individual as well. We, of course, find Catholic conscientious objectors, for example, who refuse to take up arms for the state, even when they're called upon to be in line with their obligations to the community and so on. Well, that sort of stuff, that's very much up to individual interpretation as well. And so a lot of the stuff you encounter among Americans, this idea that, the state was put here by God and you have to do what just authority says. That's not nearly as clear cut as a lot of people seem to think it is.
Right. So what are some of the subjects that you write about today, now that you've developed over the last couple of decades here with your libertarian philosophy and your look into economics and religion and all that stuff? With all that gathered into the brain of Ryan McMaken today, what are the issues that just get you the most fired up? The ones that cause you to immediately take, I would say pen to paper. I guess nowadays that's kind of an old phrase, fingers to type and that sort of thing.
Well, back before I worked for the Mises Institute, I did write a lot more philosophical stuff. But nowadays, I mostly just write whatever I think my employers want me to write. And that's a lot less philosophical, actually, just because of the nature of Mises.org. We don't spend a whole lot of time on more deep philosophical issues. A lot of that's already been covered. And we don't actually see ourselves as just a general libertarian philosophical website now. It's more focused on Austrian economics. Now, sometimes I'll write some philosophical things, but for the most part, I'm just trying to get good content up there that really explains things from an economic angle. Now, I would have to say, if I had some specific thing that I discussed on the site that was kind of my shtick, I think it would be trying to explain what does a libertarian community actually look like. In reading even Rothbard or Mises or a lot of these libertarian writers who are very good at criticizing the state and laying out the problems with the state, you find very, very little that actually tells us, well, then what would a free society actually look like? And so, what does that look like? How would that actually manifest itself from where we're going now? I find people who just say, well, if you just get rid of the state, all our problems will be solved. I find those to be the most boring and useless articles imaginable. Nobody finds that convincing. Just saying get rid of the state and everything will be fine will gets you absolutely nowhere. So you have to actually build more of a step-by-step approach. And one of the best things that Rothbard actually did on this was the issue of radical decentralization. He wrote precious little on the topic, just a few articles. But when you start to look at decentralization, it's actually the first step toward moving toward a more free society because it gives people more choice. It allows people more experimentation. And the issue at hand really is choice here. And so And I outlined this in an article titled something along the lines of how radical decentralization and anarchism are the same thing. And a lot of people, they freeze up, they get confused, they become upset when you use the word anarchism. However, they do understand the concept of decentralization and how that's feasible even in the world they understand. And so there's two poles on this. There's a world with one state, and that's the least free option. And then there's the world with potential, say there's 7 billion people. There's a world with 7 billion people unto themselves. Now, you're unlikely to have either just for prudential reasons, because few people are really have the means to just create a state unto themselves. The fact of the matter is most people are going to coalesce into groups for mutual support and so on. And you're going to have a lot of those, though. So really, if you want to move toward a more free society, you just move toward a more and more decentralized society. Now, for a lot of people, it's going to be free enough once they have lots of choices and where they feel that once states or governments or civil authorities begin to really oppress them, they have other choices to move to within close reach, where they can access those other choices in a reasonable way. And so not everybody's going to demand that that everybody live in this utopian kind of state of total individualism. That's never going to exist. But a world of a bunch of small city-states where you have frequent choice, where you can move from place to place if one of them is not to your liking, that actually is a feasible model, a feasible option for a lot of people that might actually come to pass. And so when I write on that and when people in the comments section say, well, you know, we need no civil government whatsoever, well, I just roll my eyes and forget about it, because these are exactly the sorts of people that people criticize libertarianism for. These people who are stuck in pure theory and seem to have no interest in what the most immediate next step is to creating a more free society. So I've tried to do that. What is the immediate next step we can take? And that's been kind of a focus of the website, is what can we do right now? What is the next step? What is the intermediate step? What's this in-between thing that's at least on the right road to a more free society, and not lose our minds over what if we had everything we wanted, what would the most perfect society in the universe look like?
I'm glad you brought this up, because it's a really interesting point. And, you know, if you just put out articles that just say, get rid of the state over and over, you might earn points with a lot of online libertarians, a lot of people that already consider themselves anarchists. They might, you know, high five their anarchist buddy and feel good about things, but you're not necessarily going to convince new people who are already skeptical of some libertarian arguments. So what you really need to do is bring them in and show them how, you know, some of their concerns can be assuaged. And I'm curious how you can combat, you know, when you talk about the subject of decentralization and how everyone's eventually going to be freer and better the more we can decentralize, just because people will have more choices, and this is going to lead to better outcomes essentially for everybody. How do you combat the progressive side of that argument, where they'll say, well, that's a nice theory, but if you just allow this constant decentralization, you're going to find pockets of people that are oppressed because they're going to be in whatever they want to say. Maybe it's an ignorant area of the country, they might claim, where people are not going to have rights, or maybe they have more realistic concerns. Well, I don't think this is a realistic concern in 2017, but 200 years ago, a realistic concern would be that if you don't have central control, well, some areas are going to have slavery. Some people are just going to abuse people. Or even in modern times, they might make the argument about why we need to go over to other countries and free people over there. So how do you sort of combat these arguments and still try to hold centralization as a higher ideal, even in the face of arguments that point to atrocities that could take place under decentralization?
Well, of course, we have lots of cases of centralization where horrific things happen. Of course, the Soviet Union being a perfect example. And the decentralization that happened after that, i.e. with the end of the Soviet bloc and all of the secession that took place after that, I don't see how anyone could argue that that was a bad thing. Yes, certainly Hungary breaking off from the orbit of the Soviet Union, Hungary could have, I guess, then become horribly oppressive and introduced slavery and done all of these things that the left tells us automatically happen anytime someone secedes from anything. But of course, that didn't happen. And so how do they explain why it didn't happen? Since their assumption is that anytime anyone talks about secession, it leads immediate to slavery and even more worse, horrible atrocities. The reality, of course, is that the biggest example we can come up with of secession in the last century led to far, far greater freedom than what came before it. So what's their historical argument? They're still clinging to something that happened in 1865 when the South, or 1861 when the South wanted to secede. I would remind them, of course, that it was the abolitionists who wanted to secede first, because their chant was no union with slave masters. And of course, the world would have been improved if the North had seceded from the South and provided a situation for refugees to get out of the South. The entire western frontier would have been open to non-slavery lands. It would have provided a lot more opportunity, a lot more chance for people to escape. Now, they say, well, you would have had slavery for many decades longer in the South if you hadn't had the war. What they're essentially saying is it was totally worth it that the North went in and 700,000 people were killed, which is equal, by the way, today to killing millions upon millions of Americans. So their position is that if the same thing were to happen today, they're okay with a war that would have killed 2 or 3% of the U.S. population, or equal to millions of people. I mean, it's a totally bizarre and bloodthirsty ideology, not to mention an ideology that's contrary to their professed views. So, for example, they don't want, say, Texas seceding from the Union because their assumption is that Texas would then immediately introduce slavery everywhere. Of course, Texas is a democracy with a constitution. So they like democracy, right? And constitutional government, maybe not in the type that right-wingers envision, but they're fine with it. And so what's the problem with democracy there? Their problem is they just don't like some people. So they want centralized government because they imagine that someday they'll be in charge of it, and then they'll be able to boss everybody else around. So there's so many inconsistencies there, where the biggest example, when you come up with secession, led to a flowering of freedom. They conveniently forget the anti-slavery types of secession that existed in the 19th century, i.e. among the abolitionists. And then they focus on this one example where a bunch of slave masters wanted to secede, and then also say that, yeah, going in and killing 3% of the U.S. population was perfectly fine and justifiable, when there could have been other options available, such as continued decentralization throughout North America, which that would have given more escape opportunities for the slaves themselves. So, yeah, tons of bloodshed, I guess, might have accomplished their goals, but there might have been other options as well.
Somehow it always seems to come back to the Civil War every time. I don't know. I don't know why that is.
Well, and it just shows a certain obsession with people too in the eastern U.S. Now, being from Colorado, of course, I mean, the Civil War is so irrelevant to our experience. There was never slavery in Colorado. In fact, our Constitution specifically prohibits it. And also this idea that any state on its own is going to be ruled under the iron fist of the white man is nonsense. When Colorado was created, its constitution was trilingual. About a third of the people who created the Constitution were Spanish speakers. They always took into account from the very beginning the rights of the Spanish speaking and the minority that came up from Mexico when Southern Colorado was incorporated into the Union in 1848. And democracy has worked fine here in terms of respecting minority rights and so on. This idea that we need some Supreme Court to boss us around and tell us how to respect other people has always been nonsense, at least in this state.
Hey, Ryan, I'd like to talk a little bit about your book, Commie, Cowboys, in just a minute. But first, I need to take a quick time out to give a word to our sponsors.
Hey guys, this is Roger Paxton, and if you're fed up with the government running every single aspect of your life, but you're not listening to the Lava Flow podcast yet, then what's wrong with you? Check us out at thelavaflow.com, or just go back to sucking up to the government. The Lava Flow podcast, striking the root every single episode.
This is Chris Spangle, and I am the host of We Are Libertarians, which you can find in iTunes, Google Play, or at wearelibertarians.com. We are a podcast that brings you all of the irreverence that modern politics deserves by examining current events from a libertarian perspective. So please, check us out at wearelibertarians.com.
Hey everyone, the Johnny Rocket Launchpad is Liberty. Each week we strive to bring you the best guests in talk radio. The Johnny Rocket Launchpad delivers weekly interviews of noteworthy politicians, experts, and activists. The Johnny Rocket Launchpad is bringing the party to the Libertarian Party and launching ideas in your direction. Check us out at johnnyrocketlaunchpad.com, and you can hear me, Kurt Nelson, and the beautiful Heather Nixon talk about the ideas of liberty, rock and roll.
Ryan, one thing I really want to touch on before we wind up here in a few minutes is your book. It's called, again, Commie, Cowboys. And, I grew up watching Westerns all the time, mostly because when my dad controlled the remote control, which was all the time, there were only going to be a couple things on the TV, and that was either a World War II movie or a Charles Bronson movie or a Western. And if there's any way to merge those movies at all, then that was definitely what was going to be on. But I grew up just loving Westerns, and we always hear, well, not always, but we often hear progressives sort of point to the Wild Wild West as kind of like a sort of a straw man characterization of libertarianism. Oh, you guys just want to go back to that Wild Wild West. Well, we all know everyone was just shooting each other in the streets. But what's interesting about the work that you found here is that when you go to pop culture and you look at the older Western movies, they're not really portraying that at all. They're not really portraying that libertarian society in any way, shape, or form. They're portraying something quite different. So what actually inspired you to write this book and dig into this subject? Obviously, I presume you were somewhat of a fan of Westerns at one point in your life.
Well, it was really just a research project I'd done for a graduate class. And I liked them as well as anybody. I actually hadn't seen all that many of them before I took on the book. And it evolved from a short paper into a longer paper that eventually I expanded into what's just a short book. I mean, you can read it in a few hours. It's I like a short book. I don't like long books anymore. I get bored fast. And so I forced myself to watch the 50 or 60 movies or whatever that are featured in the book.
You watched that many movies for this, huh?
Well, I don't even watch movies anymore. That book actually ruined my my liking of movies. And so now, having studied film for so long, movies all bore me now, because all I can think about are like the camera angles and the and the sets and what the actors are doing and all of this stuff. So movies are demystified and now they're boring. But some of the themes were very interesting, which I stole, by the way, from a feminist book. There was a book by Ann Tompkins called West of Everything, and she had a very interesting chapter in there, mostly on the book called The Virginian, and looked at how the Western had really cheapened women's issues. That is, issues having to do with things that happen with inside the home, domestic type stuff, things that concern women in the Victorian notions of the late 19th century. And she was saying that to a certain extent, Westerns are a reaction against this somewhat pro-woman social milieu that existed about 115 years ago now. And so I said, well, that's very interesting, because a lot of these things that she calls women's issues are really just issues that we would have typically associated with the bourgeoisie in the 19th century. That is, the liberal bourgeoisie, the social class most associated with laissez-faire liberalism. And so I dug into it a little bit deeper, and you find that, the heroes in the Western, they tend to cheapen those things that we would associate with civilized bourgeois culture. That is, entrepreneurs, business people are often portrayed either as irrelevant or stupid or actively bad, and the good guys are always government employees. And you just got to look into some of the details of some of the movies, like some of those old John Wayne cavalry westerns. A big part of what they do, in addition to killing Indians, is to prevent the white merchants from selling things to the Indians, including guns. So these old Westerns are pro-gun control, they're anti-entrepreneur, and they're pro-military.
And that's what the hero is doing. The hero is the one killing Indians and preventing people from trading with them.
Right. The hero is he's killing the Indians. He's arresting or shooting the private business owners, and also delivering self-righteous lectures to everybody who doesn't see how awesome the U.S. cavalry is. And there's a lot of that. And later, in some of these 60s westerns, which start to get kind of a social conscience on the civil rights issue. Still, the bad guys, the most racist guys, the most backward people are like the shopkeeper and the guys who have horrible profit motives, who want to make money. They're not like the kind-hearted sheriff who understands everybody's needs. So it just goes on. And it's really not until those revisionist westerns that you see later in the late 60s, 70s, and 80s where you start to get a more of a theme where it's actually the sheriff who's the corrupt bad guy, and it's sort of the black market entrepreneur who's the good one.
So as they sort of re-envisioned the concept of the Western film, they also sort of tended to flip the ideology they were portraying on their head.
Yeah, it's those revisionist Westerns, which all the right-wingers denounce as being un-American and unpatriotic and so on. Those are the good Westerns. It's because they're skeptical toward government power, and they tend to be much more forgiving of bourgeois values, where there's a much better hearing given to people who are just interested in more everyday concerns, which is what only stupid people paid attention to in the old classical Westerns of the post-World War II, because only dumb people wanted to make a profit. Only dumb people hung out at the church trying to convert people, because a lot of those Westerns are actually very anti-religious too. Those allegedly pro-American Westerns, they very much disparage religious people as being fools. And so if you were a real man, if you really knew what was important, you grabbed a gun and you got out and you started shooting people. And everyone who was worried about like civilization or God or money was an idiot. And it's amazing to me how people just totally ignore that stuff. But it's cloaked in a bunch of language of rah-rah America stuff. And so people buy into it.
I'm curious, is there any one specific Western that you watched that really just made your guts wrench more than any of the others? Are there any that specifically stood out as, my God, I cannot even stand to watch this for one more second? Or is that all of them?
Well, some are definitely better than others. I could never get into the John Ford Westerns. And of course, John Ford was a propaganda filmmaker during World War II for the U.S. government. And then he was probably made the most pro-cavalry movies. These weren't even where he had a small town sheriff. This was actually the U.S. federal government that was coming in and doing all the good stuff. And that was She Wore Yellow Ribbon and Rio Grande. Those are probably two of the best examples of kind of that subgenre. But I mean, not every movie of that period was bad. The Magnificent Seven's actually a good movie from that era, where it's a bunch of private mercenaries basically who the town hires to defend them from some other criminals. And so that was a nice it was a nice private transaction, sort of private security type movie, which is pretty good. And that was from that era, but that was kind of the exception rather than the rule. But I would just say the worst of them was probably John Ford.
And what about on the flip side of the revisionist films? I got to think you maybe have a favorite or two you can point out of those.
Well, probably my favorite of the laters where everybody likes Sergio Leone, right? The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And then, of course, he heavily influenced Clint Eastwood with his later movies. The height of the genre was probably the movie Unforgiven, right? Which everybody loved at the time. That won like a zillion Oscars as 1992, I believe. And there haven't been many socially significant Westerns made ever since. But I liked his Westerns as well. Unforgiven, of course, being very anti-violence in its themes. Now, I think Westerns have come a long way, though, in terms of their treatment of indigenous peoples. And they're actually better now than they've ever been before, because you went through these swings of the pendulum. So in the 40s and 50s, the Indians were really awful, and you wanted to kill all of them in the movies. And really, as pointed out in some other works, the Indians were just stand-ins for the Japanese. It's not an accident that all of these movies that came out after World War II were this idea of these Americans who are all held up in a fort, and they were surrounded by hostile forces, and they valiantly fought their way out and killed all the bad guys, all of whom had brown skin, of course. And this was the generation who had fought the Japanese and, of course, believed in all sorts of vicious anti-Japanese racism. And so they just kind of transferred that to the Indians then in their film. And there was this kind of this extermination theme that was frequently explored in the Westerns, where in order to be free, in order to make the world a better place, we basically have to exterminate all of these bad guys who are mucking things up for the white settlers. Now, that then swung to the other side of the pendulum, probably the most obvious and silly example being Dances with Wolves, where by then white men are evil in every respect. And when a white man goes and joins an Indian tribe, he finally becomes enlightened and then hates everything about himself that is white. Now, of course,
that movie fits in perfectly today.
You're right. It was way ahead of its time. Right?
It was way ahead of things. The SJWs must just worship Dances with Wolves. And maybe that's what really started this, and we're not even realizing it. Because I love that movie at the time, but I mean, now that when you put it like that, I don't know if I can really ever take it the same way again.
You're right. They should just remake it. They should reboot it with a lot more of explosions and CGI and stuff, and it'll be great. But most Westerns aren't like that anymore. They actually come nicely down in the middle. If you look at any sort of frontier-themed movie nowadays, there are evil and good white people and evil and good Indians or whatever is the non-white group. And so there's been a nice kind of swinging back to the center now. There's a complexity now where we recognize that there are hostile and non-hostile tribes, and the same is true of the white. So for whatever it is that the social justice warriors might be up to, Westerns are actually pretty good nowadays in that respect, in that there's a complexity. It's not easy to tell who the good guys and the bad guys are just based on their skin color, as it might have been in Dances with Wolves or in some of those post-war Westerns.
Well, it only took us 100 years or so to get to that point. So,
right. So we now appreciate that that there's bad guys on all sides, and it makes for better filmmaking too when you're doing that. It's not as just kind of this silly black and white kind of everyone's color coded thing. And so a lot of the movies are really quite good in that respect. The thing is, there aren't any big famous Westerns that you could really point to anymore, but just watching Netflix and so on, they're cranking them out still, right? Because they're cheap to make. And because all you got to do is you got to go out to the middle of nowhere in New Mexico. All right, we'll go out to New Mexico for a few weeks and we'll shoot this movie, and we don't even have to
rent
build
some horses and some cameras, and we're good.
Right. I know the only thing we got to build is like an old looking shack or something, and so it's real easy. So they're still cranking them out, but some of them are pretty decent. It's just nobody really pays attention to them as socially significant. But yeah, there's still a reason to watch them. And in many cases, they're actually better than what were made for many decades.
Oh, Ryan, it's certainly interesting stuff, and we've covered a ton of interesting stuff today. I know that because we didn't even get to any of the stuff I was planning to talk to you about. And that's what I love, though. I love when I can do interviews that go in completely different directions than I planned, and it's really been a blast. We'll have to have you back on again sometime down the road. But before we cut things off, why don't you just tell everybody a little bit more about exactly what you do over at the Mises Institute? You're editing the Mises Wire. They're, I don't know if it's necessarily daily blog, but it's very often updated, as well as the Austrian, also published over there at Mises Institute. Why don't you just tell everybody what that's all about and how they can get more involved with your other work?
Well, we update, we have about 3 or 4 articles a day, and the idea is to provide a variety of articles that people find interesting. You don't necessarily have to be into the hardcore economic stuff to enjoy the site. Really kind of my goal is to have it be a site where you don't have to be a true believer to come in and read something and find it's interesting. So I like to cover demographic issues. I like to look at trends in central banking as for some of the people who are really into it already, but looking at issues of decentralization as well. And then just general economic issues like minimum wages and affordable housing and that sort of thing. And so we try to cover all those topics. And so anytime you go in, you should just go over to Mises.org. And check it out, and hopefully you'll see at least one article per day that you find interesting, even if you're not someone who thinks of yourself as some sort of true believer in that regard.
I really do appreciate you once again coming on the show and sharing your thoughts with us. And I know nobody out there is going to be able to watch a Western anymore without either getting riled up at how anti-liberty it is, or maybe getting excited about how pro-liberty it is. It depends.
Well, the great thing about popular culture analysis is it helps people know how they're being manipulated, right? You're watching this stuff and it's manipulating you. Now, sometimes maybe that's good and sometimes that's bad, but you still hear from people think, well, it's just a movie. It's just for fun. Wrong. It's never just for fun. You're always being manipulated in some way by that stuff. So, and there's nothing wrong with watching movies. Just know what messages you're taking in.
And try to have fun. Try not to lose your mind too much over the politics, but know that it's going to be there. Ryan, thanks again so much for coming on the show. It's been a blast.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it.
All right, gang. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Ryan McMaken of the Mises Institute. And it's funny. This is why I like doing this show. I had a whole list of articles Ryan had written recently that I was planning to talk about. Didn't get to a single one of them, but that's good. That's because we had such a great conversation. We went down so many unexpected routes. I mean, I didn't even know about his book until I started doing a little more research just to do his introduction for the show, and I ended up downloading it and getting through about half of it before the interview. So I really did want to dig into the book Commie, Cowboys. Like I said, grew up watching a lot of Westerns, so I really do find his analysis pretty interesting. So I do encourage you guys to check out Ryan's work. I will go ahead and actually link to some of those articles that I was planning to talk about, and you guys can go ahead and check them out because, like I said, really interesting guy who writes a lot of really interesting stuff over there at the Mises Institute. And if you did enjoy today's interview, I hope you did if you're still listening right now and you plan to stick around, hopefully through episode 300 and beyond, I hope that you'd like to help us grow the show and get this conversation in more of those earbuds out there. And I want to tell you quickly now about 3 easy ways you can help us do just that. The first way, and by far the easiest way you can help us grow this program, is by sharing the show. By emailing it to your friends and family. You can share it from our Facebook page, facebook.com/Lions of Liberty. You can retweet us from our Twitter account, @Lions of Liberty. Or you can just talk about us to random people on the street. I don't care how you spread this show, how you share it with people, but that is the easiest and cheapest way you can help us grow this show. There are some ways you can do so by spending a little bit of money. One way you can do that is by buying a t-shirt or a koozie over at our store at lionsofliberty.store. We've got several t-shirt designs by our man Dan Smots, as well as a Lions of Liberty koozie, so you can drink along with us when we have our Libertarians in Living Rooms Drinking Liquor episodes, as we did just last week. And lastly, but certainly not leastly, because this is the really fun one, you can join the Lions of Liberty Pride. That is our paid support group. For as little as $5 a month, you can become a member of the Pride and get access to an exclusive Facebook group where you can submit questions to a lot of our guests and give input into a lot of our content, including the bonus content, which is available only to Pride members at that $5 or higher level. And we have a whole lot of fun with this stuff, especially last week when we recorded a whole nother bonus hour episode after my Libertarians in Living Rooms Drinking Liquor chat with Remzo Martinez, Johnny Adams, John Odermatt. We were still drinking. We kept this thing going for a whole nother hour, and we talked about all sorts of stuff. We talked about our views on religion. That got really, let's just say, interesting. And we just really have a lot of fun with this stuff, and we're getting a lot of great feedback from the Pride members. So I really encourage you guys to go ahead and check that out. Only $5. Worst case, you cancel, you toss it away, but I think you're going to like a lot of what you get there. And if you go up to higher levels, you can get, free t-shirts. At the highest level, $25 level, you can even participate in a monthly conference call, which is basically like a live Libertarians in Living Rooms Drinking Liquor. We usually do have a few beers and kick back and really have a nice time. We had our boy Daniel Lee, Thomas Baldwin on that last one, and we talked about all sorts of wacky stuff. Again, religion. That's been a big topic lately. I don't know why. Maybe because Jordan Peterson's been in the news a lot. He's been making a lot of waves, especially with his last appearance on the Joe Rogan program, and he was a guest on this show as well. I will link to that in today's show notes, again, over at lionsofliberty.com/296. Now, as you guys know, things did get a little boozy you might say, in the Liberty living room last week. And I did have some plans to answer a few letters of Liberty with the gang, but we just got on so many different tirades, especially related to Remzo and his thoughts about Arvin Vora's comments. He did get a bit fired up related to the military. So go back and listen to that if you want to hear a rant from a fired up 22-year-old podcaster, Remzo Martinez. Be sure to check out the Remzo Republic while you're at it. But because we got a little bit ranty and went on some tangents, we didn't get around to my original plan, which was to answer a few of your letters of Liberty last week, which of course fans of this program can submit by joining our private Facebook group. That's free. That's open for everybody. That's the Lions of Liberty Forum. You can find that just by typing Lions of Liberty Forum in your Facebook search bar. Should pop right up and we'll get you right in there as long as you look like a real person. So before I wrap things up here today, I'm going to try to do a little bit of a make good and answer a couple of your letters of Liberty.
This is another Letters of Liberty song. That last one I wrote was a downer. It somehow just fell wrong. The Lions said they didn't like it. I'm not sure if that's true. So I'm gonna keep on writing till I find the one they do. So please help me validate my poor life choices.
All right, and my first letter of Liberty today comes from Abe May. Abe asks, what can libertarians do to stop losing members/momentum to the alt-right? Well, to answer that, first we have to analyze a little bit why the alt-right is successful. Now, there's a lot, and by successful, I just mean has gotten attention, has gained political momentum. They are mentioned in the mainstream political lexicon. Many would credit the rise of the alt-right, however you define it. Some people would define it to only include white nationalists and actual racists. I don't think most members of the alt-right fit that description at all, but it really just depends on how you're defining things. To me, alt-right people are generally people that like to wear MAGA hats, like to create memes, like to, use Pepe the Frog and kind of troll and post on 4chan. That's to me what exemplifies a lot of the alt-right, but it really just depends on where you're coming from. But either way, they are certainly successful, up to potentially influencing the outcome of the last presidential election. But here's what I think we can take away from the alt-right, because there are things to learn from the attention they're getting. Most importantly, have fun. These people have fun. I think it's pretty clear, whether it's a rally, whether it's a protest, whether it's a meme, people in the alt-right have a lot of fun, and it shows, and it's infectious. When people are having fun, they're getting more excited. They're enjoying themselves, and that it can be contagious for people that are around them. Even if they don't fully understand what their message is about, just the having fun is going to attract people. It really is. We need to be dynamic, be bold. Don't just try to be the mainstream. Do not kowtow and conform to what the standard is. If you don't like the standard, you got to change the standard. If we're libertarians, if we're going to be a third rail, and I'm not just talking about the Libertarian Party, or I'm talking more about the Liberty Movement, and this is something that is going to come up in our 300th episode. That's my high-level teaser I'm going to give you for now before I make the official announcement of what I have planned. But yeah, libertarians really have to present not only a different message, a different political message with different policies we're proposing, but an entirely different packaging as well. If you're going to offer an alternative, you have to be an alternative. Don't just be a watered-down version of what we already have. I think equally so, whether you include him in the alt-right conversation or not, libertarians can learn a lot from Donald Trump in the same way. Not with his policies, but with the way he spreads his message, the way he uses persuasion in the political realm. Libertarians could do a lot of that only with a good message, with a message that comes from a place of reason and logic and caring and compassion for our fellow man. That's why I'm a libertarian. I'm a libertarian because I have compassion, because I hate seeing people thrown in jail for owning plants, because I hate seeing people die from bombs funded by my tax money just because they happen to live in the wrong place in the world. Channel that passion. Channel the reasons that you became a libertarian, that you got interested in those ideas that inspired you to even just download a libertarian podcast. Channel that energy and channel it into something that is unique and different and bold. But whatever you do, don't try to be what we already have. Don't try to be a watered down version of what's already out there. You can't just kowtow to mainstream ideas and half apologize for your views. It doesn't mean you need to go out guns a-blazing at all times in every circumstance. Obviously, the setting of your messaging is always important. You're going to speak differently sitting at the dinner table with your mom and dad than you might on a college campus if you're staging a little libertarian protest of some kind. I don't know. Point being, there's a time and a place for everything and every type of messaging. But one thing we cannot be is just a watered down version of what already is. We need to be something new, something bold, something vibrant, something with life. And I think that is what the alt-right had, for bad or for good. That is something they encapsulate, and there's a reason that they have at least inspired conversation about them. And I think we can learn a lot in that respect. Maybe not from their message, but certainly from some of the tactics and the attitude and some of the flair, if you will. I've got another letter from Zach Vall. Zach Vall, by the way, is the host of the Liberty Valiance podcast. Be sure to give that one a listen when you get a chance, when you're done with this show, of course, and all of the archives, the 300 plus episodes, all of Felony Friday, all of Electric Liberty Land. You get the point. But seriously, when you get a chance, check out Liberty Valiance. But Zach wants to know, do you think Alex Jones believes what he says, or is it just a performance? And Zach, I think the easy answer is yes. Yes, I think Alex Jones probably believes a good amount of what he says. Probably not all of it. Probably not every conclusion drawn. I think a lot of what he does is speculation, and maybe he states a lot of that speculation as fact. But Alex Jones has been around for a long time. I don't doubt that he has a lot of his political views that are probably what you might consider like an old right Republican, so to speak. I do believe that he did really want Donald Trump to be president. I don't think he was. I think that was a true view that he had. So I think many of his views he presents are true. Not necessarily every bit and nugget you get from him is true. A lot of the stories he presents to you are actual news stories that aren't necessarily covered by the mainstream. Where it gets crazy sometimes is the pathways he takes from there. But he's certainly a performance artist as well. And there's a few reasons that he's gotten so big. One of them is his business savvy, and I think we can certainly learn from that. He was out there doing his own thing on the internet, and then also making deals with radio stations and building his own radio network, and now he's got millions of listeners and millions of dollars. So he's doing something right, at least in that realm, and we can always learn from anybody that's being successful in delivering a message, regardless of what that actual message is. But there's no doubt, you've seen all the clips of Alex Jones acting like a total wackadoo, but hey, he's got the documents. So if he's got the documents, maybe there is something to it. But at the end of the day, we're all performance artists in a way. I don't feel like I'm putting on a show necessarily here, but there's some percentage of me that is. I mean, I'm not sitting here in front of my microphone talking necessarily the exact same way that I would if I'm just sitting having a casual conversation with somebody. It's not the same exact thing, as much as I try to present the truest version of myself possible. I'm not so sure Alex Jones has the same exact standards for how true of a version of himself he presents, but there's one thing you can't argue with, and that is he is an incredible promoter, and we can definitely all take lessons from that. And speaking of promoting, I've only got one more thing to promote to you guys, and that is my guest next week. He is the author of No Campus for White Men, which takes a really hard-hitting look at all the craziness that's going on our college campuses, including a lot of hateful indoctrination, specifically towards white males. So we're going to dig into that a little bit with Scott Greer from the Daily Caller next week. Until then, folks, live long and live free.